Hello, this is my presentation on DNA and Human Rights by Emily Kieran. Section 1, the differing viewpoints on DNA and human rights. There are 3 different viewpoints on DNA and its usage. First, we're going to talk about DNA evidence in the United States. Then we'll talk about DNA evidence in the United Kingdom and Europe. Then we'll talk about DNA in private corporations, such as Ancestry.com and 23andMe. Then just other basic uses of DNA evidence. So in the United States, DNA collection laws, the separation of powers. The problem with DNA evidence collection in the United States is that we have separation of powers. Each state has rights to regulate where the federal laws are silent, and each state has different laws regarding DNA collection and purging of DNA. So each state has promulgated a need to protect the citizens from inherently dangerous criminals, and that need typically supersedes the citizens' right to privacy in DNA. According to Michelle Hibbert, who is an associate attorney at Meyer, Hendricks & Bivens in Phoenix, Arizona, Virginia was the first state to pass laws requiring DNA collection for certain classes of offenders, and this happened in 1989. Their law required sex offenders and other violent felons to submit DNA samples into the state data bank. This was later expanded to include all felons upon entering and exiting prison. This was challenged in the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit and was upheld in 1992. 49 other states followed suit within 9 years and enacted their own DNA database laws, all with varying requirements for the submission of DNA. New Mexico requires submission of DNA for all convicted felons, whether violent or nonviolent. Someone convicted of felony speeding would be required to submit DNA evidence. South Dakota's law allows collection from people merely arrested for a crime. Texas will collect DNA for people who have been convicted of a sex offense or burglary with intent to commit a sex offense. If someone is arrested for one of these crimes prior to the enactment of the law, they will be required to submit a DNA sample upon subsequent conviction for any offense. As of 1999, 29 states required juveniles convicted for certain felonies to be required to submit the DNA evidence. However, unlike other records, DNA evidence was not to be expunged upon reaching majority. DNA database searching. While laws for collection are inconsistent state to state, the laws are also inconsistent when it comes to searching the DNA databases. The majority of states allow search to be done for any instance that could assist in the investigation or in prosecution. 2 state DNA databanks only allow searching for instances that help solve sex-related offenses or violent crimes. United States Supreme Court in Maryland v. King. Maryland state law allows DNA collection upon arrest for a violent crime. Alonzo J. King Jr. was arrested for first and second degree assault. His DNA was collected upon arrest and was matched to an unsolved rape case, and this was the only evidence that was linking him to the case. He appealed his conviction to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court upheld his conviction and held that the Fourth Amendment allows states to collect and analyze DNA from people who are arrested but not convicted of serious crimes. So upon arrest, they were allowed to collect his DNA and try to compare it to stuff in the system. The United Kingdom and Europe. DNA evidence in the United Kingdom. So according to Thessalonian Peace, DNA profiles are collected from suspects arrested for serious violent or sex offenses and are retained for up to 5 years in Scotland and 12 years in England and Wales. And England and Wales maintain profiles for people arrested for other crimes which aren't as serious for up to 6 years, and for those taken from minors. So the European Court of Human Rights in the case of S. and MARPER held that the English and Welsh practice of maintaining the DNA samples of those who were arrested but not subsequently convicted should be discontinued, and that is in violation of human rights. The court stated In conclusion, the court finds that the blanket and indiscriminate nature of the powers of retention of the fingerprints, cellular samples, and DNA profiles of persons suspected but not convicted of offenses, as implied in the case of the present applicants, fails to strike a fair balance between the competing public and private interests, and that the respondent state has overstepped any acceptable margin of appreciation in this regard. According to Brian Blakemore and Christopher Blake, this court held that their blanket DNA retention was contrary to Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights went further with their explanation of DNA and balancing of interests. They held that blanket retention was disproportionate to their needs. They stated that while DNA retention can be a great tool in prevention of crime, DNA contains information that can reveal information of the most private nature, such as familial information, health information, and potentially information about behavioral traits. DNA must be treated as the sensitive information that it is and not be withheld indiscriminately. The United Kingdom is an outlier in Europe. So the United Kingdom continues the retention of DNA for arrestees despite the court decision in S and MARPER. And in the court decision, it held that 5 member states, which are Belgium, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, and Sweden, required DNA evidence to be destroyed upon acquittal or discontinuance of criminal proceedings. Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands allow retention of the information where suspicions remain about the person or of any other proceedings or investigations continuing against the person. Austria allows retention if there is a risk that the suspect will commit another dangerous offense. Poland allows retention in relation to certain serious crimes. Norway and Spain allow retention of profiles if the defendant is acquitted for the lack of criminal accountability. Finland and Denmark allow retention for 1 year and 10 years respectively in the event of an acquittal. Switzerland allows retention for 1 year when proceedings have been discontinued. And France allows retention for 25 years after acquittal. However, the public prosecutor can order deletion upon his or her accord, or upon motion to the court, or upon request. So private company. So first we're going to talk about Michael USRY. He is a known filmmaker known for violent murder films. He was suspected of a murder in 1996, but they could never connect him to the case. His father submitted a DNA sample to Ancestry.com in 2015, and the police were able to use his familial DNA to track back to Michael USRY after his father had submitted that. So when he was investigated, he had actually submitted his own DNA evidence to the police and was found to be innocent, that the familial match actually didn't match the correct person. And, you know, while he was found innocent through his DNA, it raised many concerns by people who now realize that the police could track their DNA through their familial DNA based on these private data banks, where a lot of people have had concerns that, you know, while people might voluntarily give their DNA, this could create a voluntary issue since they did not voluntarily give over their DNA that they tracked through a family member. So police have demanded to started to demand DNA evidence from these private data banks. Ancestry.com and 23andMe have reported they've received requests from law enforcement agencies for genetic material. Though these demands have been rare, experts are really concerned that a few requests and possible trends coming from these requests could catch on and create a larger trend in requesting this DNA. And this concern is raised because it involves not only DNA that was voluntarily donated by someone, but it's being used as a family member match and familial tracing back to people. And it's really not voluntary when you're tracking it through family DNA. These people did not voluntarily put their DNA into the data bank. So other uses of DNA that for non-criminal retention, Another use of DNA evidence is to protect those who are victims of human rights, such as those that have been trafficked, kidnapped, or other high-risk victims. So one program has been started that's been effective is DNA Pro Kids, which is profiling DNA from children who have been trafficked or taken from their parents. Another program is the Dallas Prostitute Diversion Initiative, which collects DNA specimens to help post-mortem identification of sex workers when other places, such as therapists and medical places, have felt that these victims could be likely victims of a homicide. Other initiatives involved are inter-country adoption to confirm biological relations, missing person identification, mass disaster and war crimes identification, immigration to confirm biological relations, and military DNA databases to confirm identity upon death. So Section 1, conclusion. The United States and Europe have pretty vastly different ideas on how to handle DNA. The United States can collect DNA pretty much for almost any reason. It's not even upon arrest. They have a lot of places that are collecting DNA just by stop and frisk, stop and spit is what it's been called now, which I'll go over further in Section 2. Europe does not, for the most part, with the exception of the United Kingdom, does not allow retention of DNA based solely on meeting the law enforcement. They have to be convicted of serious crimes. And of course, in the United States, we have so many varying laws state to state that it's hard to really regulate when states have the rights to do pretty much, and it hasn't been challenged in court. The United Kingdom is a lot like the United States. They keep DNA for pretty much whatever reason, but they are still vastly different from the remainder of Europe. And moving forward, this is a highly unregulated piece in the United States. And really looking at it, they really could get more regulated as time goes. So Section 2, Human Rights and DNA. So thesis. My thesis is that international citizens have human rights to their DNA. The majority of nations have laws that regulate DNA retention of those who have not been convicted of crimes, and the United States should follow the example and expunge DNA of those who have not been convicted. Again, S and MARPER v. the United Kingdom. This case involved two different separate cases that were brought together. One was an 11-year-old and the other was an adult who were charged with crimes and were later acquitted or had their cases formally discontinued. And despite not being convicted, both had their DNA retained in the United Kingdom. The European Court of Human Rights held that the retention of the DNA was in violation of the European Convention on Human Rights. And the right to respect private and family life, that's what they turned on, is that the European Convention on Human Rights has held that the people have a right to respect for their private and family life. And while the court agreed that the retention of DNA can be an important police tool and investigative tool and can be imperative in the prevention of crime, the court was bothered by the indiscriminate and all-encompassing nature of the retention in England and Wales. The DNA samples were retained irrespective of the nature of the crime or the age of the suspects, and that this blanket level retention put the United Kingdom in violation of the human rights laws. So it was mostly that blanket retention that put them in violation of the law. Of course, the majority of Europe, the largest piece of the S and MARPER case was the explanation of DNA and how it's handled in the rest of the European Union. No other nation in the European Union had a blanket retention policy for DNA evidence this broad. And in contrast, the majority of the nations in Europe and the European Union will require the destruction of DNA evidence upon acquittal and can only retain the DNA evidence under stringent circumstances. So human rights concerns on retention. One major concern about DNA retention is the accessibility of the information and the fact that the government can more easily track people through their DNA profile. DNA allows for repressive governments an enhanced ability to suppress its citizens by being able to track them to different places, such as protests in a country that is not committed to freedom of assembly. This stored information can also be a concern regarding personal medical information. whether someone is suitable for immigration, employment, or other such programs that might use genetic medical information against them. In other ways, health insurance, if they are able to access DNA and show they had a predisposition to maybe breast cancer or to another medical issue, they could be denied health care insurance here in the United States based on their DNA evidence. Another issue regarding DNA retention is biosurveillance. This is a new term that's been coined by a lot of these places where hackers can gain access to the information. An example that's promulgated by the DNA Policy Initiative is someone in witness protection. If someone is suspicious about someone that has been relocated, they simply need to get access to their DNA through abandoned DNA, chewing gum, anything like that. That could either confirm their identity or even potentially track that person back to their family through their DNA familial lines and use that DNA against them. Human rights concerns regarding racial bias and prejudice. Another issue regarding human rights and DNA is that minorities are more likely to be prosecuted for criminal offenses than minor offenses, and DNA databases include a disproportionate number of minorities. Further, people who are mentally ill and children are often arrested for minor offenses. So if DNA is taken upon arrest, depending on their country of origin, especially here in the United States, the DNA will stay in the database in perpetuity for being pretty much arrested for a very minor offense. The laws of retention upon arrest disproportionately affect minorities, the mentally ill, and children. The United States and stop and spit. So the police have started collecting people's DNA even when no crime has been committed. They request the DNA of adults and juveniles during routine traffic stops and basic interactions with the police. This practice is mostly unregulated and unlegislated and pretty much untried in court. And since there's no legislation in place, there's nothing to stop police departments from collecting DNA without just cause. Private police DNA databases are increasing, and there's no regulation to protect privacy rights. However, these collections are done consensually, and this process has not been tried in court. And whether consensual is like stop and frisk, many people don't know their rights or the implications of these databases and how easily their information is accessed by the police and how easily it is stored. Some departments have gone to collecting DNA from abandoned DNA sources such as cigarette butts and chewing gum when they otherwise can't get the DNA voluntarily from people. So safeguards and standards, these are some of the things that need to be questioned per the DNA Policy Initiative, and some things we should think about. Under what circumstances should the police be allowed to collect DNA and store samples and profiles? And really, most people believe that it needs to be under probable cause upon arrest for a sex offense or violent felony. Are there any procedures to destroy individual samples or records when they are no longer needed? Especially here in the United States, people's DNA evidence does not get destroyed upon release from custody or upon acquittal for a crime, and that information gets pretty much stored in perpetuity. What data is sent to whom, and is it kept securely? That's a question you'd ask. Many places, keep them in databases, but it can be shared between departments, between federal and state, and it can really be shared anywhere they want it to. What technical standards must be met by the DNA profiles before they are loaded to the database? Another issue that comes up is that DNA evidence can sometimes be wrong if it's not handled correctly, if it's not entered correctly, if it's not done, handled through the scientific methods. Are quality assurance procedures being followed in the labs and that analyze the DNA? And we need to make sure that there's not cross-contamination of DNA. They could track to somebody and actually not be their DNA. How are DNA matches used in court, and is corroborating evidence needed? A simple DNA match going into court actually really scares me, that if it's just based on DNA and there's no other evidence that places somebody there other than their DNA, DNA can be transferred in many different ways, not just by somebody physically being there. Can the database and samples be used for additional purposes other than solving crimes? This is another piece that scares me too, is that DNA can be used for a multitude of things, like we saw with connecting family members together, placing people at the same place. It can be used for other things even when crimes aren't involved. Is there any independent oversight and information about how the database operates? A lot of these little smaller databases could, without, strict oversight, could share information, could do whatever they want with the information. Is something we really need to look at. Are safeguards included in legislation or only in guidelines that can be easily changed? We have really no legislation here in the United States with regards to these private police databases that are used independently, that any of the policies can be changed on a whim based on where the DNA database is located. So here in the United States, we really need to work on legislation that prevents just the acquiring of this information ad nauseum, pretty much. So conclusions for part 2. The United States needs to follow the lead of the majority of Europe and only keep DNA for persons convicted of sex offenses and serious felonies, and no more of this, stop and spit type collection of DNA and just maintain these excessively large databases. People have the privacy right under the Fourth Amendment, and I think the court held actually incorrectly in that case, stating that you don't really have the privacy right that people can keep your DNA evidence in perpetuity. The United States needs to meet the standards and safeguards described in the last slide, making sure that everything is handled correctly, that there's more oversight, better legislation, and ways to get your DNA removed if you are not convicted of a crime. By maintaining DNA for those who have never committed a crime and keeping the DNA in perpetuity, the United States is violating the basic human rights of its citizens. And I really feel that we need to follow that same basic tenet followed by the European Court on Human Rights and follow their procedures. Section 3, course conclusion. So obstacles, I did encounter obstacles in my research. There's an overwhelming amount of information available, and sifting through the information became pretty tedious. The tedious part was finding enough time to be able to sift through the information. I have a pretty hectic work schedule and family life schedule, and it threw obstacles in my way every step of the way. But information literacy helped me quickly determine reputable from non-reputable sources, and that became increasingly important in my research for this class. Addressing obstacles. The best way that I addressed the obstacles was to refine my search terms in the online library. Using Boolean syntax provided more narrow resources and allowed me to find more relevant resources quickly. And then I also dedicated more time to do my research instead of just trying to piecemeal my research around a hectic family and work schedule. Best and worst sources. The best source I had is the online library and the journal article database. There's so much information available that it makes the best tool. However, there were some articles that I looked for that looked extremely promising that were not available upon clicking the link that they showed up as not available. I tried to find those articles through other sources, but did not have any luck without another subscription site. Questions and problems I still have. I'm in my last 2 classes here at AMU, and I've realized I have actually become pretty strong at conducting research and analyzing sources for their credibility. AMU has done an amazing job preparing me to think critically about information and resources, and not just to accept information on blind faith. So one example that I've seen recently that exemplifies the need for information literacy lately is the group of people who are okay with the repeal of Obamacare because they are on the Affordable Care Act, not realizing that the 2 programs were the same thing. Had they used information literacy, they would have realized that they were being duped by the media, and that more critical thinking would have shown them that the 2 programs were the same. Our media and our politicians work extremely hard to deceive us. It's imperative that as individuals, United States citizens and global citizens, we do our due diligence to know and understand the correct information, not just the propaganda. Only when we know and understand the truth can we be informed, can we formulate our opinions, really work on lifelong learning and understanding the world around us, and being able to formulate adequate opinions and to turn those opinions into action as global citizens. So we're excited.